Welcome to Through the Lens of Christ, a podcast designed to have conversation about things that are happening in culture, questions that we may have theologically, and other questions that impact our day in and day out lives. Our desire is to be able to build these conversations and to be able to get us to critically think not just about the events that are happening, but how do we see these events through the lens of Christ. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I hope it helps you to critically think through issues in our lives. Morning, Ashley, Steve. How you both doing?
Good morning.
Good morning. Fine, thanks.
Good. We once again back to have a conversation about what's going on in Acts, what's happening in the early church. What are we to learn through the expansion of the gospel? What is the Holy Spirit teaching us by adding some of these stories through Luke? And so we'll be talking about Cornelius, at least the beginning of that account, and Acts chapter 10, verses 1 to 8. So Steve will read and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. All right, here we go. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, "Cornelius." And he stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa.
So we're introduced to this Cornelius. We see, and it happens, almost sequentially with what was happening in Lydda and Sharon. And so Peter's still in Joppa. He's still ministering to people there. Still staying with Simon the Tanner, who, again, has some tie into what we'll talk about next week, in that God has Peter stay with a very unclean person in a very unclean place, just as kind of a foreshadowing of what's to come and how he's moving Peter. But it's later. But we come to Cornelius and are introduced at least to him and his situation. So what are some things that maybe caught your eye?
Well, the first thing is the way the Lord's working on Peter. I think if he gave him the whole message at once, it'd probably just kill him. I mean, he just couldn't handle it all. So he's just dosing him with this stuff, right? I mean, because he's about to go into shock, like you said, further on anyway. So it's just crazy.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, Peter is he's just the impetuous, like emotionally driven, like, and yeah, I agree. Like if he gave him everything, that would be an interesting last chapter in Acts. Like what would have happened if, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, I do have one thing. So the one thing that I think, if you're just reading bits and pieces of scripture and you just read this section about Cornelius, you're going, well, this guy's a solid Christian. So, right. And it really doesn't become evident. I think it's plainly evident later that he's really not. Like, and you mentioned that in the message. I think that's really important. Anybody else that just takes these 8 verses and says, well, this guy's reverent, man. I mean, he's righteous with the Lord. He's good. There's no way he's not going to heaven. And he hasn't even heard. The deal is, I mean, he hasn't heard the gospel yet. And faith comes by hearing and by the gospel, and he hasn't heard it. So I think that's really important. That's an important thing.
Yeah, I do. I think that's so interesting because even today culturally, like you'd read the account of this guy's life and you'd be like, I wish I could be a Christian like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I need to live up to that standard. And yeah, I just think it's so telling that this isn't the image of a Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just not. It's an image of somebody who isn't, and not to be harsh on Cornelius, but he's pretending to be. He doesn't know any better, right? He's trying, right? But he's pretending to be. he's heard what he should look like. He's heard the law. He's seen other people live it out. He's like, okay, that's what I want to do. And so he mimics that behavior as though that is, and not that his heart wasn't in the right place, and not, but having your heart in the right place does not mean that you're actually saved or that you're a believer. And I just think it's not this idea of, well, he faked it till he made it, and finally God made him one, right? And
Right.
getting either of those things misconstrued is missing the point of the whole chapter. So you're right. I wanted to be a little careful, because you read those first 8 verses and you just think, hey, this guy's already a Christian. All we need to do is rubber stamp this thing through,
Mhm.
and he's in good shape, and the text is saying something different.
Yeah. So here's one analysis, or one way to think about what he's done. He has assessed himself, and he's assessed the world around him, and he's learned how the world works by example and by the odds of things happening. This has happened this way in the past. This is the way it should happen now. Here's why it's happening. I've assessed it all in my mind. I've assessed my relationship. So I have something of a knowledge of the way the world works, and I'm working myself into that world so that I'm at peace with it, so that I'm in harmony with it, so I can interact with it. He sees the miracles, he sees all these things happening, and so that's how he runs his life. He runs his life in concert with the design of the world, knowing his design as much as he does, and knowing the world's design, and he lives his life, which isn't a bad, rational, logical way to live. It's just not a saving way to live. It's still a lost way to live, and you're still lost in your sin, and you can't get out of it because you have no mediator and you have no redeemer. So that's to me is the state of him, and that's the state of a lot of people. There's a lot of people that have trouble meshing themselves with the world. They either don't understand enough about the world or about themselves, and they can't figure out how to harmonize that. And there's all kinds of problems, and mentally and physically and relationally and with work and everything else with that type of person. But that may not be who Cornelius is. He may have well figured out how to mesh with the world and do well, and he's still not saved.
Right. Yeah, I think that's just so important, right? The idea of he's trying, and again, it says that his offerings went before God. I believe his offerings were sincere, right? I believe that his intentions were pure. I believe he's looking at it going, I wish I had a relationship with this holy God. I wish I were in that family, but wishing it doesn't make it so. And I think we do need to come to a place of not just, and I said it on Sunday, but how many times does somebody say, hey, what makes you a Christian, or why do you think you're going to heaven, or well, I'm a good person, or I try to do good things, or I try to, I try not to do the things that other people do, or it's often very works based, and it's very, just and some of that is just the pervasive, especially in our context, is the pervasive Catholic and Lutheran background, where it is this very kind of high church model. So they bring absolution. There's, I talked a bit about the keys, right? They hold the keys, the church holds the keys, and then everybody else, you're just trying to make it work. And so it's almost the same thing that we do in the world, where culturally you're trying to conform to things, where you're just trying to conform to the church or whatever the rules are. And I think that's your point, is that conforming is not the same as transforming, and there's a difference. We can look the part, but it doesn't make us the part. And so I just think again, I think that's the major crux of understanding Cornelius, is we should identify with that man, and we should understand that no matter how hard we try, and it's not that we shouldn't try, it's not that Cornelius is condemned because of his efforts. It's not, we should be working, but it's this matter of where does that come from, and what is the kind of catalyst of those actions.
Right. And to add one more thing to what you're saying, that whole idea between the difference between evangelicals and, say, Roman Catholics or Lutherans is a big difference. So, I mean, it caused the Reformation happened. Even, of course, the Lutheran churches came out of the Reformation, but the idea being that the church can actually get in the way of salvation, right? As long as you're a member of the church and the church approves of you, the local church or say the Roman Catholic Church or maybe a Lutheran church, as long as you're approved in that context, then you're in. Evangelicals don't believe that. They go to the person. It's uniquely personal. It's not just that I'm a member of the church and the church has the keys, as you say. We have to have a personal relationship, a personal faith in Christ. And I think that's what the Bible teaches clearly. I think they've gone beyond that to give more power to the church than the church should have. And it ends up keeping people, well, in God's in control of everything, but it keeps people out of heaven at its worst.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's actually the beautiful part. Like it's hard to say you're not good enough, right? It's hard to it's especially like I said in our present culture, it's really hard to say that I'm not good enough. And but that's the beautiful part of the message is that God knows we're not good enough, right? I mean, that's the Old Testament is showing us like God already knew it, right? He's not proving to himself that we can't do it. He gave us the law to prove to us and our stubbornness and pride and arrogance to say that you can't do it. And so we have to get to a place that we go, I can't, right? Cornelius, I'm sure was frustrated. I mean, that, no matter how hard he tried, he was still outside the family. No matter how hard he tried, he was never going to be a part. And, that's the feeling that we should have of, we're just not enough. And no matter what I embrace and no matter what I do, I'm not going to change who I am. It's only through Christ that we're changed. And this idea of transformation. So I do think it's the key point of that part of the text.
Yeah, the other, it leads me to the other problem is the idea of we stand before God with we're not inherently righteous. It's not a righteousness of our own. It's a righteousness that's given to us by the Lord. So he doesn't have that yet. He doesn't have the Lord's righteousness. He's got his own righteousness, which is no righteousness at all. He's in the danger zone. He's just in danger. Yeah. So it goes.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly could have, not to get to the later text, but once he hears about who this Christ is, he very well could have gone, you know what? I'm already living a good life. I'm already giving my money. I'm already doing the right things. I really don't need this other thing, right? So, Peter, I really appreciate you making the trip. I'm not sure why God wanted to bring you all the way out here, but I'm actually doing pretty good on my own. And we hear a lot of that in different ways today, right? Is that you don't want to be too religious, right? You don't want to get in too deep. You don't want to be like overly spiritual. And it's basically us just trying to retain our ability to save ourselves and pushing away the actual only hope that we have. And Christianity or the idea of religion can become a very self-righteous work and completely miss the point of what it should be. It should be a very humbling experience. It should be a very selfless experience, and that should bring us into actual hope.
What do you guys think about the idea of, okay, so Cornelius is doing all these things and now he finds out about Christ? He's like, well, what does that mean to me? I'm already doing all these things. What does that mean? Because you're right, because he could have just said, oh, thanks for the information. I'm fine. I'm already doing these things. Right. So is that a common? Surely that's a common thing. I bet it's a common thing.
I'm awkwardly waiting for Ashley to speak. Just I've got thoughts that want to come out, but I'm holding them. So
I think it's a huge mindset shift. Because he spent his entire life doing the things, checking the boxes, making sure, am I praying? Am I giving? Am I doing all of these things? Do I look the part? It's essentially he's getting up and putting on his Christian outfit for the morning and doing those things for the day, each and every day. And so then to shift and go, well, you can do those things, but none of that means anything apart from Christ. And that's got to be a little shattering to the identity that you've built for yourself and the life that you've lived this far. And to then completely shift it to, I could continue to do those things, but they mean nothing when it comes to salvation. And so to change that, I think it's hard.
I think Paul, and I think it's I think it's Second Corinthians, but anyway, he says that the um the power of God is either it's either the breath of life or it's the stench of death.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of what we're talking about is that if like Cornelius, when he knew something was missing, he knew something wasn't quite right, he's pursuing after God, albeit in a non-saving way. And then when he finds out who this Jesus is, it's the breath of life, right? He just like, I want to take that in. I want to be consumed by it. And to others, it's the stench of death, where it's like, why would I have to give up myself? Why would I have to die to self? Why would I'm too important to me to want to get rid of me.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think people are going to hear it in one of two ways, and I don't think God's surprised by how we hear it. It's a matter of, am I going to be drawn in by this truth and this hope as Cornelius is, or am I going to reject it, thinking that I'm good to either one? I might be an atheist or an agnostic and just say this doesn't make sense, and you know what, it's for somebody else.
Mhm.
I am always more deeply, I guess, personally wounded by those who are in the church, who are living as though Cornelius is, who are seemingly trying to do the things. And then when you talk to them about who Christ is, or you talk to them about what transformation looks like, or they give the responses of, you know what, well, you don't want to get too deep, or you don't want to, you know what, you can't, you got to be careful with all that stuff, or you know what, I'm doing the right things, I'm good enough, and that's just that's a hard thing to know, that you can live a life pretending to pursue something that you really don't love, only to find out in the end that you're going to be rejected by that thing. And it's a heartbreaking thing to know.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I think that's right. Because you've got there are like, well, there's in a couple different ways. There's more than two types of people, right? So you've got the it's either the breath of life or the stench of. So would it be so nice that it would be that clear to people, that people would actually think about what's being said and understand it in a way and internalize it in such a way that they can come to a point of decision of, yeah, I love this Lord, or I don't love this Lord. But what happens is most people just kind of get in the routine and run it. That's the person you're talking about. They're like, well, yeah, I'm a believer because I've self-proclaimed myself as a believer, obviously. And so you can't deny what I've just defined myself as and what I'm living it out. See what I'm doing? I'm at church. I'm doing these things. I love hanging out with these people. And it turns out they've never thought deeply enough about it to whether to bring it to the point of being the breath of life or the stench of death. They haven't even got there yet. I don't know.
Right.
My sense is that's more than half the people at times. There's a lot of people in that camp. A lot of people. I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, all of us should continue. We should, well, I want to do at least is continue trying to move away from that camp as far as possible and
Yeah.
get into what does it mean? Is this right? How does the Lord want me to change? What is he doing to me? That's
Yeah.
that's where I think when we're driving toward Christ, we'll be in a better place by doing those things. It's
Yeah. And
enjoyable.
it is. When I think one of the things that we do embrace this idea of identity so deeply today, this idea of who we are, and this idea of being good enough, and the idea of you can't judge me, and that I am proclaiming myself as something, so therefore you just need to go along with that. And we see that in the culture, we see that in our churches, right? And the idea of being a self-professed believer without actually understanding who Christ is. I mean, that's a real thing. And I think the idea today of even the political scene and the cultural scene, where um, we try to act and do things that are opposed to culture because we know that some of those things are wrong, but then it almost becomes this self-righteous act of me doing things so that I can show that I'm pious, so that I can show that I'm something. And again, not that those things, and I think we'll talk a little more specifically, but not that those things are bad in terms of our actions, but it's just the motivation and constantly coming back to, why am I doing what I'm doing? And we talked a little bit kind of off camera just about the things that are happening in the world today with how the LGBTQ movement. I mean, we're here in the middle of June. It's Pride Month, right? You can't avoid those things, and it doesn't really matter what type of organization that it is. In some way, the expectation culturally is that they will embrace it, right? And so you're seeing these things all over the place. The question then is, as believers, what do we do? Right. Well, and on some sides it's we're going to boycott and we're going to push back, which again, I don't have an opinion on what I think that's a conviction issue, right? People need to wrestle through that personally. And I think that if you're convicted to do that and it's motivated by the right things, then do that. You may not be convicted to do that, then don't do that, right? But there is this idea of now I want to show my Christianness by making claims and stating things and pushing back and fighting back, and I don't think that's right either. But again, to me, there's not like a what should we do, what shouldn't we do, as much as a how am I pursuing Christ in all things? How am I making sure I understand what I believe? How am I teaching my family well? How am I talking to other believers like this or other people in a church? How do we wrestle through these things together? How do we make sure my response isn't some emotional, just some personal thing because I don't understand what's happening in the world, but that we're actually reasoning through scripture and trying to understand how all these things fit together. And so I don't know if I kind of just threw that out there to start the conversation, but the idea of what do we do in a world as believers, both professed and genuine, like what do we do in a world that is seemingly so rejecting of what we believe?
Yeah, there's a couple things I think about that. One is, our culture is definitely performative. And I was mentioning about, say Cornelius or any of a number of people, logically, rationally interacting with the world around them. That's really what's going on. This is people logically and rationally interacting with the world around them. In many cases, they see and they can read the tea leaves. They understand what's going on in our culture, and in order to interact with the culture in a harmonious way, they both have to agree with a certain aspect of the culture, many aspects of the culture, and also have to restate it in positive terms and perform it. And so that's just the age we live in. It's always the age, but these are the hot button issues of the age now. And so what do you do with that? I mean, what we could do as Christians, and that's, I think, part of your point of us protesting and doing things on a Christian side of things, we can take that performative aspect and apply it to the Christian life as well. And we can perform out the Christian life for others. And we have these two plays, right, that are going on at the same time, combating each other. And that's just not going to work. First of all, I don't believe that Christ is in that necessarily. And I also think that the world and the world systems is going to overwhelm the church in that aspect. So surely part of what we're to do is, like you said, interact with other believers, interact with people on a personal level, have real relationships and deeper relationships so that we can know and be known. On the practical side of all the boycott thing, I agree with you. I think it's a conscience issue. I think it's something that people need to decide how they're going to spend their money and what they're going to fund and what they're going to support, because buying an item from a retailer is supporting the retailer and all that they stand behind. But I'll also say that almost every retailer you purchase from, certainly if it's a national retailer, has got a lot of issues, almost for sure. So what I also think, this is maybe a little more radical than you expected, but I also think that we're moving toward parallel societies. I think there's a Christian, as we develop relationships and understanding with people, I do think we're going to find ourselves more and more wanting to do business with people that we know as believers, or at least that we know, and less business with people that we don't know, and with larger corporations that we don't care how, or it's not we don't care, we don't like how they're spending their money. And so I do think, I mean, Christians, true believers in the marketplace right now are being pushed out. And I think we have to go somewhere, and we still have to be able to live and feed our families, and we have to be able to buy things and sell things. And some people aren't going to want to buy from us, and some people aren't going to want to sell to us if we have a certain point of view and they know it. So there's a lot to that, but I think that's happening. And I think over the next 5 or 10 years, it's going to continue to happen. We will all see it. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think the really good stuff in there. I think the just the word performative, I think, is something that people should get really comfortable with, right? That because we're performative as well, and understanding that that's not a point of salvation, right? That operating well in the performance is not what saves us. But I think it is something to watch out for on both sides. But I think you're so right about, first of all, we can boycott a lot of things. My personal views on this, not that this is right or wrong, but my personal views on this is that we have to trace every purchase if we're really going to say I'm taking a stand for something. Otherwise, to me, it becomes performative, right? It's like if I do, okay, so if I'm not going to buy this shirt from this retailer because they operate in this way, so I'm going to buy it from this other thing. Okay, well, do I know where that shirt was made? Do I understand the owner of the factory that was made in? Do I understand where the yarn came from? Do I, right? How
Right.
far back do you take this thing? And that's why, like, I don't get too worked up about this stuff because I'm also intimately involved in some of this industry, right? So, like, I see beyond just the what's happening at the rack. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be convicted. And if people are convicted to not purchase, then you're right. I mean, less money we have moving into certain places is a good thing. So I don't like, I'm not debating it per se, just saying that make sure we're not just being surface level and trying to give a performance so that we can get credit for our piety, that there's actually something behind it. And I think what you said is absolutely right. I mean, we talked, man, it's been probably 8 years or so since the book came out, but Rod Dreher talked about the Benedict option. And this idea of, and again, not, I think he was probably early in his assessment, but I do think in certain ways that we're going to be moving to that path, right? I even think about, we talked, there's some of the kids that in our local community put on a play, for a few days ago, right? And um, even so, knowing that all of the people in this play, right, largely homeschool group, largely Christian people, like, I mean, these are what we would consider to be like, okay, these are good things, right? When they sell things out back, right? They're knitted hats. I was joking that we own half the knitted things that they sold because of the kids and everything. Like, to me, that is a kind of a heartwarming thing, right? Is that, look, I mean, our little kids super happy to be able to buy some of that stuff and get a penguin and get a hat and get a scarf and whatever that is, but also knowing who made it. Also understanding where the money's going, understanding what's being done with this. Like, that to me is what is important. It's not about just buying stuff to buy stuff. It's trying to I'm hoping that this whole movement moves us as believers into a more intentional lifestyle, that we do kind of count the cost of everything we do, and how do we get really intentional about glorifying God even in a purchase of a knit hat at a play. Like, everything takes on new meaning. And I'm not like we should or shouldn't boycott. I think, again, matter of conviction. What I am encouraging people to do is that we live with intentionality, and that we do see the greater things at work, and that this, I believe, and I'm blindly hopeful, but I hope that what all this movement does is bind the church together more than it ever has before. And when I say church, I mean the true church, believing members of the church.
Mhm.
How does it bind us together in a new way? And yeah, I think coming out of that, I don't think you're that far off on the parallel societies and where it takes us, because the two things should reject each other.
Mhm.
And you know what? As the church grows, it should be rejected by the world. And as the world moves further into culture and self-worship, the church should reject that further. So there is this rejection. That doesn't mean war, right? That doesn't mean that
Right.
we hate one another. It just means that we're going to operate in different purposes. So I think it's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking here as you're talking, a couple practical things that can be done. Like, do you know a contractor at church or a believer that does a certain type of work that you could hire? And you might get some prices for maybe even a semi-major project. And somebody comes in a little high and you don't know them. They're a regional contractor. You know nothing about them, but the guy in your church will do it for a couple $1,000 more. I'd hire him in a heartbeat. I mean, or if you have work that needs to be done around the house, you could actually hire it out, but you might even know somebody in the church that does that type of thing. Maybe it's even for free. You know, I need to hang some cabinets in my basement. I could hire a contractor to come hang the cabinets. I'd rather have 4 or 5 friends come over and work on it with me. And so I want to be, I mean, this might sound, this really isn't selfish of me. Trust me, it's really not. I'd rather say, come over and do it for free with me. Come help me. Ask for some free help. and let them come over. We can fellowship and do it together. And I want to be the kind of person that's responding to them as well, to someone else in the church that says, I could use a hand. I'm like, well, don't hire out. Let me come over and help you with that. Or I know a guy. Let us come over. So there's ways of developing that softly that I think could be helpful. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to, I mean, if you're a guy, maybe ladies have the same thing, I don't know. But if you're a guy that has a project around the house and you can have a buddy come help you work for a few hours or a half a day, both of you usually have a way better time than you would have had doing something on your own. And if you can go over and help them do the same thing, I have found it's an enjoyable experience. It takes the drudgery out of it. You get something accomplished, and you get to develop a friendship. We can't beat that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Yes.
Ashley, any final thoughts?
I don't have any, thanks.
It's okay.
Just wanted to check. I think this conversation is so good. I think the idea of Cornelius and understanding and again trying to tie these things together, right? Cornelius is living a performative religion. He is trying to operate in a way that looks the part but is insufficient. And we're going to see that play out. But this idea of even today culturally that we need more than what the world has to offer. We need to be deeper than just performance based, and we actually need to know the one that saves. And once we have a transformed life, it should express itself in how we spend our money, the people that we hang out with, and how we approach projects at the house, and like every detail should just have a higher level of intentionality. So I think this is a really good conversation because we're all trying to wrestle through this new world, this changing world, this ever-changing world, and how do we fit into all these pieces? So good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.